Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night, your mind racing with worries, fears, and anxieties that seem to take on a life of their own in the darkness? That moment when the world grows quiet, but your thoughts grow louder. When you feel most vulnerable to the shadows that dance not just on your walls, but within your soul. We've all experienced those midnight hours when our spiritual defenses seem weakest, when doubts creep in like unwelcome intruders, and when the battles we fight aren't against flesh and blood, but against the very forces that seek to separate us from divine love. In those moments, wouldn't it be profound to know there exists a spiritual shield so powerful that even the forces of darkness cannot penetrate it? This is not just wishful thinking or spiritual fantasy. This is a reality that Saint Ignatius of Loyola discovered through his own spiritual warfare. A protection so profound, he claimed that with it in your grasp, hell itself cannot touch you. But what is this shield? And how can something so simple offer such extraordinary spiritual protection? The answer lies not in complex theological arguments or elaborate religious rituals, but in something much more fundamental to our faith journey. It begins with understanding what Ignatius himself discovered during his profound conversion experience while recovering from battle wounds at Loyola. Before we explore this spiritual shield, it's important to recognize that Ignatius wasn't always the saint we venerate today. He was a proud Spanish nobleman, a vain military man captivated by dreams of worldly glory and romantic conquests. His conversion didn't happen in an instant of divine revelation, but through a slow, painful process of interior transformation that began when he was forced into stillness. Confined to his bed after a cannonball shattered his leg in battle, Ignatius requested books of chivalry to pass the time, but was given only a life of Christ and stories of the saints. Reluctantly reading these texts, he noticed something fascinating about his interior movements. When he daydreamed about courtly love and military heroics, he felt momentary pleasure that quickly faded into emptiness. But when he imagined himself following the examples of saints like Francis and Dominic, he experienced a lasting peace and contentment that remained even after his imagination moved on. This was Ignatius's first lesson in what he would later call discernment of spirits, the ability to recognize the different spiritual forces at work in our lives. And it was through this discernment that he began to understand the power of having the right spiritual weapons in our hands. What Ignatius discovered wasn't a magical object or relic, but something far more powerful. It was the transformative practice of placing ourselves consciously in God's presence through contemplative prayer, particularly through meditation on the life of Christ. The shield that hell cannot touch is not a physical object, but rather a state of spiritual awareness and connection that places us firmly in the protective embrace of divine love. The practice that Ignatius specifically recommended was holding the awareness of God's presence as we fall asleep. By consciously placing ourselves in God's hands as we drift into unconsciousness, we create a spiritual environment where the forces of darkness cannot gain a foothold. This is what it means to sleep with this in your hand, as the title suggests. The this is not a physical crucifix or rosary, though those sacramentals can certainly aid our devotion. Rather, it is the conscious act of surrender to God's protection, the deliberate choice to rest in divine presence rather than in the vulnerability of spiritual isolation. What makes this practice so powerful is that it fundamentally changes our spiritual orientation. Think about the moments when you feel most vulnerable to fear, doubt, or spiritual attack. Isn't it when you feel most alone, most disconnected from the source of all goodness and love? What Ignatius recognized is that this sense of separation is precisely what the forces of darkness exploit. By consciously placing ourselves in God's presence, especially as we surrender to sleep, we close that gap of perceived separation. We acknowledge that even in our unconscious state, we remain held in the hands of a God whose love for us never slumbers. I'd like to pause for a moment here and ask you something important. Have you ever experienced those moments of spiritual vulnerability when fears and doubts seem to overwhelm your sense of God's presence? That feeling when the darkness seems more real than the light? When your faith feels fragile in the face of life's challenges? I want you to know that you're not alone in this experience. Saint Ignatius himself went through intense periods of spiritual warfare and doubt. If this resonates with you, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I too have faced the night." And if you feel comfortable, briefly tell us about your experience. Your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel understood in their own faith journey. Sometimes, The simple act of acknowledging our spiritual struggles begins to diminish their power over us. Now, let's delve deeper into the theological foundations of this Ignatian insight. What Ignatius understood profoundly was that spiritual protection isn't primarily about defensive measures against external threats. It's about maintaining a proper relationship with God that naturally excludes contrary influences. This understanding is rooted in the fundamental Christian belief that God is not just more powerful than evil, but is the very source and definition of goodness itself. Evil is not an equal and opposite force to God, but rather the absence of God, much as darkness is the absence of light. By placing ourselves consciously in God's presence, we are not so much erecting a barrier against evil, as we are filling ourselves with a presence that, by its nature, leaves no room for evil to operate. This reflects the words of the Apostle John. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The victory is not won through struggle, but through presence. Darkness doesn't need to be fought. It is simply dispelled when light enters the room. Similarly, the forces that seek to separate us from God's love cannot operate effectively when we are consciously dwelling in that love. This is why Ignatius could make such a bold claim about hell, not being able to touch someone who maintains this spiritual awareness. It's not that evil forces don't attempt to influence us, but rather that their primary weapon, the illusion of separation from God, has been neutralized. The Ignatian understanding of spiritual protection also involves a profound insight into the nature of human freedom. Unlike physical battles where we might be overpowered by superior force, spiritual battles always involve our consent. Evil cannot simply invade our souls against our will. It requires our cooperation, our agreement to step away from the light and into the shadows. By consciously placing ourselves in God's presence before sleep, we are making a free choice that aligns our will with divine protection. We are, in essence, exercising our spiritual freedom in its highest form, by choosing to dwell in love rather than fear. This understanding challenges the common misconception that spiritual warfare is primarily about power. Many Christians mistakenly view spiritual protection as a matter of having enough faith or spiritual strength to resist evil forces. But Ignatius offers a fundamentally different paradigm. The protection comes not from our strength, but from our surrender, not from our power, but from our positioning. By placing ourselves consciously in the presence of God, we are not relying on our own spiritual muscles, but on the unfailing embrace of divine love. This is tremendously liberating because it means that spiritual protection is available to all of us, regardless of our perceived spiritual strength or maturity. Consider how this changes our approach to those moments of vulnerability. Instead of trying to muster more faith or courage when we feel spiritually threatened, we can simply turn our attention to the ever-present reality of God's love. This is what makes Ignatius's insight so practical and accessible. The practice doesn't require theological expertise or extraordinary spiritual gifts. It requires only the willingness to turn our hearts toward God, especially in those moments when we feel most vulnerable. One of the most powerful examples of this practice in Ignatius's own life occurred during his time at Manresa, where he spent nearly a year in spiritual retreat after his conversion. During this period, Ignatius experienced both profound spiritual consolations and terrible desolations, including scrupulosity, so severe that he contemplated suicide. What brought him through this dark night was not his own spiritual strength, but his growing ability to recognize God's presence even in the midst of interior darkness. By anchoring himself in divine love, especially through meditation on the life of Christ, Ignatius found that the voices of condemnation and despair gradually lost their power over him. This experience shaped Ignatius's understanding of spiritual protection in a deeply personal way. He came to see that the most dangerous spiritual attacks are not those that tempt us toward obvious sins, but those that distort our image of God, making the divine appear distant, judgmental, or indifferent to our suffering. By consciously placing ourselves in God's presence as we fall asleep, we are reinforcing an accurate image of a God who is close, compassionate, and constantly attentive to our needs. We are reminding ourselves of what is always true, but sometimes forgotten, that we are never alone in our spiritual journey. The practical dimensions of this Ignatian insight extend beyond the moment of falling asleep. While that transition to unconsciousness represents a particularly vulnerable spiritual state, the practice of consciously placing ourselves in God's presence can and should permeate our entire day. This is the heart of what Ignatius called the examen, a simple but profound spiritual exercise that bookends our day with awareness of divine presence. By beginning our day with gratitude for God's protection through the night, and ending it with a conscious return to that same protective presence, we create a rhythm of spiritual awareness that strengthens our resistance to forces that would separate us from love. Let me share with you a concrete example of how the exam works in practice. Imagine setting aside 5 to 10 minutes at the end of your day, perhaps sitting on the edge of your bed before lying down to sleep. You begin by quieting your mind and heart, perhaps through a few deep breaths or a simple prayer inviting God's presence. Then you look back over your day with gratitude, noticing moments where you experienced goodness, beauty, or love. Recognizing these as manifestations of divine presence, you move to awareness, reviewing the events of your day more carefully, noticing where you felt close to God and where you felt distant, where you responded to grace and where you resisted it. You might feel a gentle sorrow for the moments you moved away from love, but this leads naturally to hope as you look forward to the day ahead, asking for the grace to recognize and respond to God's presence more consistently. The final step, which connects directly to our theme of spiritual protection during sleep, is to consciously place yourself in God's hands for the night. This might involve visualizing yourself resting in divine embrace, praying words of surrender like those found in Psalm 31, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," or simply expressing your trust in God's constant care. This practice doesn't need to be elaborate or time-consuming. Even a brief moment of conscious connection can establish the spiritual orientation that Ignatius found so protective. What makes the exam so powerful as a form of spiritual protection is that it trains us to recognize God's presence in all aspects of our lives, not just in obviously religious moments. This is connected to another key aspect of Ignatian spirituality, the conviction that God can be found in all things. By developing this awareness, we gradually dismantle the false separation between spiritual and secular aspects of life that often leaves us vulnerable to negative influences. When we recognize that God is present in our work, our relationships, our struggles, and even our failures, we expand the sphere of divine protection to encompass our entire existence. This holistic understanding of spiritual protection reflects Ignatius's own journey from soldier to saint. He didn't reject his military background when he embraced a life of faith. Rather, he transformed his understanding of what true spiritual battle entails. The same courage, discipline, and strategic thinking that served him on earthly battlefields became the foundation for his approach to spiritual warfare. This integration of his full life experience allowed Ignatius to develop a spirituality that was both deeply contemplative and actively engaged with the world. We see this integration most clearly in Ignatius's concept of being a contemplative in action. Unlike some spiritual traditions that emphasize withdrawal from the world as the path to spiritual safety, Ignatius believed that true protection comes not from avoiding life's challenges, but from facing them with an awareness of God's presence. This doesn't mean that times of retreat and explicit prayer aren't important. Indeed, Ignatius structured his spiritual exercises as an intensive retreat experience, precisely because he recognized the value of dedicated time for spiritual renewal. But the goal of such experiences is not to escape the world, but to return to it with a transformed vision that recognizes divine presence even in the midst of life's complexities. This understanding has profound implications for how we approach spiritual protection in our daily lives. Rather than seeing protection as something we need only in extraordinary moments of spiritual attack, we come to recognize it as the constant reality of living in conscious relationship with God. The practice of falling asleep in God's presence becomes a powerful symbol of this broader truth, that we are always held in divine love, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. The spiritual shield that Ignatius discovered is not something we pick up only when danger threatens. It is the fundamental reality of our existence as beloved children of God. Consider how this perspective transforms our understanding of those midnight fears and anxieties we discussed at the beginning. When we find ourselves lying awake, troubled by worries about the future or regrets about the past, the Ignatian response is not to battle these thoughts directly, but to gently turn our attention to the present reality of God's love. This isn't a form of spiritual bypassing that denies legitimate concerns. Rather, it's a way of placing those concerns in their proper context. Yes, we face real challenges and difficulties in life, but we never face them alone, and they never define the ultimate truth of who we are as beloved children of God. This brings us to another powerful aspect of Ignatian spiritual protection: the practice of imaginative contemplation, particularly of the life of Christ. Ignatius discovered that by entering imaginatively into gospel scenes, he could experience the reality of divine presence in a way that transformed his heart and mind. This wasn't just a devotional exercise, but a profound form of spiritual formation that aligned his interior movements with the movements of divine grace. By regularly engaging with these contemplations, especially before sleep, Ignatius found that his dreams and unconscious thoughts became increasingly shaped by divine love rather than by fear or worldly attachments. The specific practice Ignatius recommended involves selecting a gospel scene, perhaps the Nativity of Jesus or a healing encounter from his ministry, and using our imagination to enter fully into that scene. We might visualize the setting in detail, hear the voices of those present, even imagine the smells and physical sensations of being there. The goal is not historical accuracy, but spiritual encounter, allowing ourselves to be present to Christ and experience His presence to us. As we carry these contemplations into sleep, they create a spiritual atmosphere that naturally repels influences contrary to divine love. What makes this practice so effective is that it engages not just our conscious mind, but our emotions, senses, and imagination. Those aspects of ourselves that often remain active even as rational thought gives way to sleep. By filling these faculties with sacred content, we create an interior environment where divine presence feels more real and immediate than the fears or temptations that might otherwise disturb our rest. This holistic engagement reflects Ignatius's understanding that spiritual protection must address the whole person, not just our intellectual assent to religious truths. The power of imaginative contemplation is particularly evident in Ignatius's meditation on the two standards, which directly addresses the reality of spiritual warfare. In this meditation, we are invited to imagine two opposing scenes. On one side, Christ gathering his followers under his banner of humble love. On the other, the enemy of human nature assembling his forces through tactics of riches, honor, and pride. Rather than depicting spiritual battle as a direct confrontation of power against power, Ignatius portrays it as a fundamental choice of which standard or flag we will serve under. The protection comes not from fighting, but from choosing, not from resistance, but from allegiance. This perspective challenges common misconceptions about spiritual warfare that often leave believers feeling vulnerable and fearful. Many Christians have been taught to see themselves as constantly under siege by demonic forces that can only be held at bay through vigilant spiritual combat. While Ignatius certainly acknowledged the reality of evil influences, his approach emphasizes God's overwhelming love rather than the enemy's limited power. The focus is not on what we're fighting against, but on what we're embracing. Not on the darkness we fear, but on the light we choose to dwell in. Think about how this shifts our emotional experience of spiritual protection. Instead of living in a state of anxious vigilance, constantly scanning the horizon for threats, we can rest in the confidence of being held in divine love. This doesn't mean that we become naive or unaware of negative influences, but rather that our primary orientation is toward the goodness that surrounds and permeates us. The peace that comes from this orientation is itself a powerful form of protection, creating an interior environment where fear and anxiety cannot easily take root. We can see this peace exemplified in the lives of saints who faced extraordinary external challenges without losing their interior serenity. Consider Teresa of Avila, who was deeply influenced by Ignatian spirituality, and who famously said, "Let nothing disturb you, nothing frighten you. All things pass. God does not change. Patience achieves everything." This wasn't just positive thinking. It was a profound recognition that when we dwell consciously in God's presence, we participate in a reality that transcends the temporary troubles of this world. Teresa, like Ignatius, discovered that true spiritual protection comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them with an awareness of being held in divine love. This brings us to a crucial question. How do we maintain this awareness of divine presence when life's challenges seem overwhelming? Ignatius himself faced this question during periods of spiritual desolation, when God seemed distant and his heart felt dry and lifeless. His response wasn't to deny these experiences or to berate himself for lack of faith. Instead, he developed practical guidelines for navigating such times, recognizing them as inevitable parts of any authentic spiritual journey. Chief among these guidelines was the counsel not to make significant changes during periods of desolation, but to maintain the spiritual practices and commitments established during times of consolation. Applied to our theme of spiritual protection, this means that the practice of consciously placing ourselves in God's presence before sleep becomes especially important during those seasons when we don't emotionally feel that presence. By continuing the practice even when it seems mechanical or meaningless, we express a deeper faith that transcends our changing emotions. We acknowledge that God's protective love doesn't depend on our feelings or perceptions, but remains constant through all our interior weather. This constancy in practice helps us weather spiritual storms that might otherwise overwhelm us. Ignatius also recognized the importance of community in maintaining spiritual protection. While the practice of falling asleep in God's presence is deeply personal, it doesn't happen in isolation. We are supported in this practice by the prayers of the entire communion of saints, both living and deceased, who form a spiritual shield around us through their intercession. This is why Ignatius founded the Society of Jesus as a community of mutual support and shared mission. He understood that we are stronger together than alone, better able to discern authentic movements of the Spirit when we can check our experiences against the wisdom of others. In practical terms, this might mean sharing our spiritual practices with trusted friends or finding a spiritual director who can help us navigate the complexities of interior life. It might involve joining a prayer group or faith community where we can both receive and offer support in living a life of conscious connection to divine presence. The point is that spiritual protection isn't a solely individual concern, but a communal reality, something we participate in together as members of the body of Christ. This communal dimension reflects a broader truth that Ignatius emphasized. Spiritual protection isn't primarily for our own comfort or security, but for mission and service. We seek to dwell in God's presence not to escape the world's troubles, but to engage them more effectively, bringing the healing and liberating power of divine love to situations of suffering and injustice. The practice of falling asleep in God's presence renews our spiritual resources so that we can wake to serve with greater freedom and effectiveness. It's a form of protection that empowers, rather than merely defends. Consider how this understanding might transform your daily life. How might your work, your relationships, your engagement with social issues change if you approached each day from a place of being securely held in divine love? What fears might lose their grip on you? What new possibilities for service and connection might open up? The spiritual protection that Ignatius discovered isn't just about feeling safe. It's about being empowered to live with greater freedom, authenticity, and compassion. This empowerment extends even to how we face the ultimate human vulnerability: death itself. Ignatius included in his spiritual exercises a meditation on death not to induce fear, but to clarify our values and priorities. By contemplating the reality that one day we will fall asleep for the final time in this life, we are motivated to live more intentionally, more lovingly, more aligned with what truly matters. And by practicing the conscious surrender to divine presence each night as we fall asleep, we rehearse in a small way the greater surrender that awaits us all, training ourselves to trust that we will be received in love even as we let go of everything familiar. This perspective offers profound comfort in the face of mortality, not by denying death's reality, but by placing it within the larger context of eternal love. Just as we trust that God watches over us during the vulnerability of sleep, protecting us through the night until morning, so we can trust that the same love will carry us through the night of death into the dawn of resurrection. The practice of falling asleep in God's presence becomes a nightly parable of this greater truth, a practical way of internalizing the hope at the heart of Christian faith. So, how do we actually implement this Ignatian insight in our daily lives? Let me offer some practical suggestions that build on what we've discussed. First, consider creating a simple bedtime ritual that helps you transition consciously into God's presence. This might include a brief examination of conscience using the examen prayer we discussed earlier, a few minutes of scripture reading, or simply a moment of quiet gratitude for the day's blessings. The specific elements matter less than the intention to place yourself consciously in divine hands before surrendering to sleep. Second, you might find it helpful to have physical reminders of divine presence in your sleeping space. This could be as simple as a small cross by your bedside, a meaningful scripture verse posted where you'll see it as you prepare for bed, or a sacred image that helps focus your attention on divine love. Again, these objects aren't magical talismans, but rather aids to consciousness, gentle reminders of the spiritual reality you're choosing to dwell in. Third, consider how you might extend this practice of conscious presence throughout your day. Ignatius recommended what he called particular exam, a brief pause several times each day to check in with God and notice where you stand in relation to divine presence. These pauses, which might take just a minute or two, help maintain the spiritual orientation that forms the basis of true protection. They're like spiritual compass checks that help us reorient when we've begun to drift away from our true north. Fourth, don't underestimate the power of community in sustaining this practice. Share what you're learning with trusted friends who can check in with you and support your intentions. Consider finding a spiritual director or mentor who is familiar with Ignatian spirituality and can guide you in applying these insights to your particular life circumstances. Join or form a prayer group where you can discuss and practice these spiritual disciplines together. Remember that we're not meant to walk the spiritual path alone. Finally, be patient and gentle with yourself as you develop these practices. Spiritual growth unfolds gradually, like a plant slowly turning toward the sun. There will be days when the practice feels rich and meaningful, and other days when it seems rote or empty. Both experiences are normal parts of the journey. What matters is not the emotional quality of each practice, but the consistent intention to place yourself in God's presence, trusting that this orientation itself provides the protection you seek. If these reflections on Saint Ignatius's teachings about spiritual protection have touched something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel where we explore together the path toward a deeper and more authentic faith. Each week, we share teachings inspired by the lives of the saints to transform our spiritual life and draw closer to God. You are not alone in this search. Many of us are trying to live our faith with greater fidelity in today's complex world. Thank you for sharing this moment of reflection. Your presence here is already a sign of grace at work in your life. As we draw to a close, let's return to where we began. Those moments of midnight vulnerability when fears and doubts seem most powerful. What Ignatius offers us is not a magical solution that eliminates all spiritual struggles, but something far more valuable. A way of being in those struggles that changes their fundamental nature. By consciously placing ourselves in God's presence, especially as we surrender to sleep, we transform vulnerability from a liability into an opening for grace. We discover that our very helplessness becomes the ground for a deeper experience of being held, protected not by our own strength, but by a love that never sleeps. This is the profound paradox at the heart of Christian faith, that our greatest weakness, fully acknowledged and surrendered to God, becomes the site of our greatest strength. It's what St. Paul meant when he wrote, "When I am weak, then I am strong." It's what Ignatius discovered through his own journey from worldly ambition to spiritual freedom, from reliance on his own courage to trust in divine protection. And it's what we can discover anew each night as we practice this simple yet profound spiritual discipline. The claim that hell cannot touch one who sleeps with awareness of divine presence isn't an exaggeration or a spiritual boast. It's a recognition of the fundamental truth that where God's love is consciously received, the forces of negation and destruction lose their power. Not because they don't exist or don't attempt to influence us, but because their primary weapon, the illusion of separation from God, has been neutralized by the practice of conscious connection. What remains is not a battle to be fought, but a presence to be embraced. Not a fear to be overcome, but a love to be received. So tonight, as you prepare for sleep, I invite you to experiment with this Ignatian practice. Take a few moments to quiet your mind and heart. Recall with gratitude the ways divine love has been present to you throughout your day. Acknowledge any areas where you've moved away from that love, receiving forgiveness with simple trust. Then, consciously place yourself in God's hands for the night, perhaps using words from Scripture like, "I will both lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." Notice how this conscious surrender affects the quality of your rest and the nature of your spiritual experience. Remember that this practice, like all spiritual disciplines, grows stronger with repetition. Don't be discouraged if you don't immediately experience dramatic results. The protection Ignatius describes isn't primarily about emotional feelings of security, but about a spiritual reality that operates whether we're consciously aware of it or not. By consistently placing ourselves in God's presence before sleep, we're aligning ourselves with this reality, allowing it to gradually transform our experience from the inside out. In the end, what Ignatius offers us through this insight is nothing less than a new way of being in the world, a way characterized not by fear but by freedom, not by anxiety but by peace, not by isolation but by loving connection. This is the heart of the good news that Jesus himself proclaimed, that the kingdom of God is here, now. available to all who choose to dwell consciously in its reality. By practicing this awareness, especially in our most vulnerable moments, we participate more fully in the divine life that is our true home. And in that participation, we discover a protection so profound that indeed, hell itself cannot touch us. Not because we've found a spiritual formula or technique, but because we've aligned ourselves with the love that is stronger than death, the light that no darkness can overcome, the truth at the heart of all existence. Sleep well, beloved child of God. You are held through the night and always in hands of perfect love.